and it's an honor for us to have him present. So, Jonathan, the floor is yours. Give him a warm welcome.
I think I'm on. Supposed to be on. Okay. Can you hold this for a second? I want to be in the center. Thank you. This moves. Great. Okay. Lovely. Camera-wise. Yeah. Okay. Shalom, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. My name is Jonathan. In reserves, Jonathan Concricus, Lieutenant Colonel, used to be. Now I'm just Jonathan. I'll clarify in the beginning. I hope everybody can hear me all right. Can you hear me in the end? At the end? Yeah? Great. So I'll clarify just to avoid any misunderstandings. I used to be the IDF international spokesperson for 4 years between 2017 and 2021. And then perhaps a few of you or many of you have seen me as a reserve spokesperson for the IDF during the first months of the war. Perhaps we've been on the same Zoom calls or updates or TV, Swedish or international. But today I speak on my behalf. I don't represent the State of Israel, and I do not represent the military. Many of the things that I will say are more or less the same as what the State of Israel says, but some of the things that you will hear me say are actually critique of the Israeli government and of our policies and what has happened over many years, things that I, of course, would not say standing in uniform, but that I can say now as a civilian. I'd like to thank Konrad. Where did Konrad go? And the entire team at MIFF for organizing this truly amazing event. And I'd like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules, and instead of being outside and enjoying beautiful Oslo in lovely spring weather, you're here and you're spending your time and resources and energy on Israel. As an Israeli, I thank you for that, and I want to begin with saying thank you. Now, little bit more down like this. Is that better? Yep. Okay. This wasn't made for the size of my head, but okay. So what I'll do is that I'll talk for about half an hour, give or take, and then I would like to leave a lot of time for questions. I know that you have your system here with the SMS, etc. So I'll leave as much time as possible for questions and interactions. Usually people have lots of questions, and most of the time that is the most beneficial part of meeting a speaker. Tomorrow I'm going to be speaking, drilling down on the situation in Gaza, focusing on what the current situation is from a military perspective, and then where we may find ourselves the day after, what I don't think is a feasible solution, and what I think would be a great solution, and what I think will actually happen in the end. And it's neither of those two options. And we'll do that tomorrow. So for those of you who want to know about Rafah and Gaza and Gaza City and the hostages and all of the other very burning topics that we're going to speak about, that's best saved for tomorrow. Today we're speaking about two areas, Lebanon and Gaza, and the common denominator of two different UN organizations, each in a different area, how they have indirectly or directly contributed to the horrible situation that we're in, and what I believe needs to be done in order to promote a solution that provides prosperity, security, and ultimately peace for Israel and peace for our neighbors. That is the topic. Now, it's a very good timing. Yesterday, the General Assembly voted for the second time and basically indicated to the Security Council and indicated to the world, to Israel and to everybody else, that many countries in the world want to see a Palestinian state and that they think that they are ready for statehood. Part of what we're going to talk about today is related very much to that. In short, what I saw as an Israeli yesterday was, again, the international community through the UN, which is still the only global body that has legitimacy and power. The global community decided to reward terrorism, and in an act of, I think, tremendous naivete, the Palestinian delegation in the room, they are all Fatah, Palestinian Authority. Some of them are people from the old guard who have been around with the Palestinian so-called struggle for many years. Some of them have blood on their hands, some of them don't, some of them are diplomats, but they are less relevant because Riyad Mansour, the representative of the Palestinians at the UN, he is not the guy who will benefit from this vote. The guys who will benefit from the global vote to create a Palestinian state, as the situation is now, are Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif and Hania, the leaders of Hamas. Because for me, at this current point, I have no doubt that if a Palestinian state is created now, within a very short matter of time, it will become a Hamas state. And for me to look at the votes and to look at that situation, I think it is tremendously naive and sad that this was the vote that was adopted. I'm sure that many of the countries who voted in favor probably didn't think about it, probably don't want to concern themselves with what the future will be, and they probably believe that it is a good and fair thing for the Palestinians to have a state. I also want peace. But I don't want it with an enemy next to me that has the same ideological set of principles like Daesh, like ISIS. And that is Hamas. Now, this isn't going to be a usual talk about Iran and Israel's enemies and the situation in Gaza. As I said, we'll be focusing on the various tools that the international community has put in place through its only executive organization, the UN, in the Middle East. And we will assess their effectiveness, and we will assess what their actions have led to. So we are now more than 218 days into this war. It started on October the 7th with the Hamas attack that we are all too familiar with, sadly, and soon to be followed a day or two after October the 7th by a relentless campaign by Hezbollah against Israeli civilians and against the military. Israel long ago crossed the mark of 600 dead soldiers. About half of them died or were killed on October the 7th in an attempt to defend Israeli communities. About half of them have died since in fighting inside the Gaza Strip. More than 900 Israeli civilians have been killed. And as we will speak about, there are still 132 hostages held by Hamas for more than almost 7 months. There are casualties on the Lebanese side as well. Quite a lot of Hezbollah fighters have been killed. There's a bit of ambiguity about numbers. Higher estimates speak about 340, perhaps 350 Hezbollah fighters. Lower estimates speak about 290. But it is a sizable number for an organization by the size of Hezbollah nevertheless. In Gaza, Israeli troops have taken control of the Rafah crossing, but they don't control much else in Gaza. As we're speaking, Israeli troops have, or the IDF has informed residents of Jabalia, which is an eastern neighborhood of Gaza City, to again evacuate the area because the IDF is going to again, for the third time, go into Jabalia and clear it of Hamas terrorists because we have intelligence and indications that Hamas has re-established itself in Jabalia, has used the fact that the civilians have been allowed semi-officially to return to Jabalia, and they are now establishing themselves there, and the IDF is pushing in a very local offensive, and that is happening as we speak. We have not yet been able to return our 132 hostages. Israeli communities around the Gaza Strip, what we call the Gaza envelope, still lie in ruin. Many of its once peaceful inhabitants, people whose life mission was to create peace between Israel and Palestinians. Many were butchered, many were taken hostage, few of them have been returned, many are still in Hamas captivity, and these are people that had in their calendar for the evening of Saturday, the 7th of October, to go to a peace rally in Tel Aviv and to urge the government to create peace with the Palestinians and to improve the conditions in Gaza. How do I know that? I went to Kibbutz Nir Oz, one of the communities that was hit the worst. 1 out of every 4 people in Nir Oz was either killed, wounded, or abducted on the 7th of October. And in the kibbutz dining hall, there's the big billboard where people write announcements about services that they can provide or information for the community. And what caught my eye when I went there, I brought a group of American congressmen to see it, was that there was a big poster saying on Saturday night of the 7th of October, there will be 2 buses leaving the kibbutz, and we're going to a peace rally to call on the government to leave the territories, in Hebrew, latzet mi'ashtachim, and to create peace with the Palestinians. These are the people of Nir Oz who brutally were slaughtered in their homes and taken as hostages. And sadly, only few have returned to their homes. In northern Israel, the situation isn't much better. I sadly have to admit that there are ghost villages, ghost kibbutzim in northern Israel, all along the border between Israel and Lebanon. They basically are void of civilians. Many of these kibbutzim were founded before the State of Israel was founded, and they endured hardship, significant hardship, wars against Syria and Lebanon, and difficult conditions, but none of those conditions forced them to leave their homes. Sadly, today, Israeli civilians, between 75 and 95,000 of them from the northern part of Israel, including Kiryat Shmona and Metula, have been forced out of their homes, and they have not yet gone back to their homes. I speak about that, and I will bring that in the summary of what I say, because this war will not end until these Israelis are able to go back home. And they won't be able to go home until some sort of resolution is found that will provide security in Israel and in Lebanon, which is exactly half of the topic that we're going to speak about. So in this talk, I will try to explain how this happened and focus on 2 different UN organizations that have been active or inactive, and what this means for the future of the region. Now, beyond your support for Israel, and the name of the organization, I think it's a beautiful name, it's to be with Israel for peace. That's excellent, and that's exactly what I believe in as a proud Israeli and Zionist. I want people to believe in us and support us, and I also want to establish peace with our neighbors. Just like we did with Jordan and with Egypt, I would be happy for there to be a warmer and more genuine and people-to-people peace. But if it's a cold peace or no peace, I take the cold peace and I start working on it for the future. But beyond that, the topic of what we're talking about really has relevance for Europe as well. This isn't something that will be contained for the Middle East. If things deteriorate worse between Israel and Hezbollah, I think that the road to regional conflict that will possibly create massive waves of refugees and perhaps destabilize or disrupt a lot of the balances of the Middle East and Europe, I can see a straight line connecting. So we're talking about Israel and Lebanon, and we're talking about Gaza, but we have to keep in mind that what happens in the Middle East usually doesn't stay in the Middle East, and it has a way of finding itself out of there. Now, in Gaza, despite a massive flow of international aid that is being brought in through 4 different land corridors, 1 naval port, and also dropped from the air, The problem that we face in Gaza that exists in terms of getting humanitarian aid to the people who need it is a problem of distribution. It's not how much aid the world can bring to Gaza, is how much aid can be brought to the people who need it, those who are really suffering. And I, as a military officer, have feelings and empathy for civilians who are suffering. I can see and know and acknowledge, and I do not belittle, and most Israelis feel empathy even for enemies on the other side and people who support our enemy on the other side. And when you know that there are women and children and elderly and orphans who need help, Israelis want to help. But the problem has been the final part of the distribution. And that relates exactly to one of the organizations that I'm going to speak about, and that is UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Work Agency, founded just after the State of Israel was founded, one of the first and very unique so-called aid organizations that were built, which has an open mandate, has been working on the ground, deployed in the entire Middle East, but specifically a lot in Gaza, and we're going to be speaking about it. Hamas, and we've seen this on video, and there's a lot of testimonies about it, is stealing humanitarian aid in broad daylight. It is also firing with live bullets at Gazan civilians who are attempting to obtain food, and there's a lot of videos about it now of brave citizens that have sent it out. But the problem is really deeper than that. In my mind, in my opinion, and by the way, I'll say this before I'll say my opinion. I was raised in Sweden, and I was raised in a society that really glorifies international organizations, that believes that international organizations like the UN are a tool for the improvement of the world, that they are the solution for many of the things that are wrong to fight disease and hunger and inequality, and many of the same notions that are very strong in Norwegian society are of course existing there as well. That's where I grew up, and I've done kind of a shift in that sense, and I no longer see everything that has a blue emblem of the UN as a positive power. And I say that with sadness, because I would want for the situation to be different. I would want for the blue emblem of the UN to mean impartiality, lack of corruption, dedication, a focus on doing right and on providing aid to those in need. The examples that I will be giving are totally the opposite. In my mind, UNRWA is an abomination that perpetuates suffering. It perpetuates the victimhood of Palestinians, and it sustains an environment that has already produced generations of terrorists from Gaza. By the way, not only from Gaza, but we're focusing on Gaza. It is an organization that helps to glorify jihad and to glorify martyrdom, shuhada. The common denominators between Lebanon and Gaza, these two failed areas, they're quite plentiful. There's poverty, there are extreme interpretations of Islamic teachings, there's a ruling terror organization, Hizbollah in southern Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and there is a weak or complicit UN organization that are part of the problem. One of these organizations may be part of the future solution, the other one definitely isn't. Another extremely important common denominator, which many times is left unspoken about, is Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which controls Lebanon indirectly through Hezbollah, and it provides Hamas and the Islamic Jihad in Gaza with almost all of their weapons. Without Iran, without the Iranian regime, October 7th would not have happened. We wouldn't have been in a 7-month war with these three organizations, and they wouldn't have been firing rockets and missiles at us from Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza. That wouldn't have happened. We may still have had enemies there, but they wouldn't have had the same equipment, the same organization, the same ideological and political guidance, and they wouldn't have been coordinated under one umbrella. So a common denominator is also Iran. Now, I want to be clear and to be fair. Israel's security and the security of its inhabitants is first and foremost the responsibility of the Israeli government. It's not the responsibility of any other organization. It's first and foremost our responsibility to take care of ourselves, and of course the defense establishment as part of it. But part of the security architecture in the north, in Lebanon and in northern Israel, relied on international assurances and a large peacekeeping force which was designed to basically prevent a third Lebanon war. It was put in place in 2006, and it was given lots of money, lots of soldiers, lots of political backing, lots of attention, and the job, although they didn't say it like this in the resolution, was basically prevent a second Lebanon war from happening again. I think that we can all agree, looking at the situation now, is that this architecture has failed. We are this close, and we're getting closer that every day that goes by from a third Lebanon war that can turn into a regional war that will consume most of Lebanon, large parts of Israel, and it will have massive regional influence, and it may cause the involvement of other regional players who will seek the opportunity to fight against Israel, and maybe some of Israel's allies, if they have their compass straight on that specific day, will do the right thing and stand up and defend Israel as well. We don't know. So this architecture has failed. It's apparent to see for everybody who wants to acknowledge it. But sadly, when we look at the different options, I think most people still cling on to this architecture of international assurances, some kind of a diplomatic deal, and maybe people do that because they believe that it's the only solution that we have that isn't war. Now, in terms of my personal background, I feel confident enough to be speaking about UNIFIL in Lebanon and UNRWA in Gaza because I served as a soldier in these two areas. I fought in Lebanon and I fought in Gaza as an infantry platoon commander and company commander. And then I spent a good 7-8 years out of my life in liaising with UN peacekeeping forces. I was head of the IDF liaison team to UNIFIL between 2009 and 11, and then afterwards I served on the Golan Heights, so I liaised with UN peacekeepers on the Golan Heights, and then I liaised with both of them from the Northern Command. I was very happy and proud to represent the IDF. I was happy when we were able to save UN peacekeepers from attacks in Syria. We saved about 75 Filipino peacekeepers whose position was being fired at and overrun by Syrian jihadists. We saved 3 unarmed UN peacekeepers who were taken hostage by Syrian rebels. One of them was Finnish, not Norwegian, but Finnish. And I stood by and we saw in Israel how different peacekeeping forces, UNDOF on the Golan Heights and UNIFIL in Lebanon, basically started to contract and become smaller and smaller and have less of an influence on the areas that they were operating. Specifically about UNIFIL in Lebanon. The acronym is United Nations Interim, temporary, Force in Lebanon. It has been here, it has been around since 1978, but what I'm talking about, it is its current iteration after 2006, in which there's more than 10,000 soldiers, peacekeepers. They have an annual budget. I don't know if anybody in the room knows, but they have an annual budget of more than $510 million US. They claim they also have a maritime force. They have lots of civilian jobs that they provide to local Lebanese. They claim to perform 450 activities every day, as per their website. But 450 activities per day have reached absolutely nothing of significance when it comes to preventing attacks on Israel, when it comes to implementing their mandate. They may patrol, but they do not patrol where it's important. They may conduct reconnaissance, but they definitely don't look where they're supposed to look. And if they happen to stumble upon something that is actually relevant, rest assured that they will not report it. And that the Security Council won't know about it, and it will not be written, not in the newspapers and not in the Security Council reports, that something has been done by Hezbollah. I also served at the UN headquarters. I was the first Israeli officer to be seconded on behalf of Israel to serve at the UN. And it was a very interesting period. Thank you. It was a very interesting period. I always had a little Israeli flag. I actually had it specially made, a double flag, a UN and Israeli flag. I went to the gift shop at the entrance of the UN headquarters, and there's these neat little boxes where there's flags and UN flags for each country. For some mysterious reason, there wasn't an Israeli and UN flag together. So I wrote them a few annoying emails, and I said, I'm a staff member, I'm Israeli, and I think that I should be able to have the same pin as everybody else has. And it took a few months, and eventually I got my pin, and then I wore it every day so that people would know where I'm from. And it created a lot of opportunities for me to learn about the UN, about the institution, about the institutional bias, and sometimes very thinly disguised anti-Semitism that exists at the UN. And it was very, very insightful for me. So that gives quite a lot of experience as well. Now, this isn't reported in Norwegian media, for sure, and it's barely reported in American media. But to date, Hezbollah, since the 7th of October, has fired more than 3,000 rockets towards Israel. Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other Palestinians in Lebanon, but all of these together have fired more than 3,000 rockets, missiles, and drones at Israel. Just the last week, Israel has had 4 combat casualties, 3 soldiers and 1 civilian that have been killed by Hezbollah fire. 2 months ago, we passed a milestone, a very bad milestone, where for the first time 2 months ago, there were more rockets being fired at Israel from Lebanon than there were from Gaza. Why? Because Hezbollah is still totally capable of firing rockets because nobody is interfering with the fact that they are firing rockets at Israel. All of these actions by Hezbollah are clear and irrefutable violations of UN Security Council Resolution 1701. The same resolution that was put in place by the Security Council at the end of the Second Lebanon War in 2006 in order to prevent exactly where we are now, which is on the cusp of war, a broader scale war. If we go back to Gaza, UNRWA, in the early stages of the war, and this also hasn't been reported very much in the mainstream media, they made a critical strategic decision based on directives that they were given by Hamas. Israel went in and prepared October the 7th, the massacre, hostages, you remember all that, and then Israel prepared itself to launch an offensive against Hamas in northern Gaza. And Israel, out of concern for the lives of civilians, said, all of the civilians who live in Gaza City and in northern Gaza, move south because we're going in. And we're going to fight against Hamas because this is the most important Hamas infrastructure that exists. And if you want to live, move south. Sadly, what happened the day before was very strategic. There was a meeting between Israeli officials and UNRWA and other UN organizations. And the Israelis told UNRWA, this is what's going to happen. We are going to start in a few days, and we want you to help us move civilians out of the battle space, because we don't want the civilians there. If they stay there, the chances that they die are very high. It's going to be a very dangerous environment. We care about not killing civilians. We want them out of there. And we ask you, UNRWA, the de facto semi-government of Gaza, help us move them south. Call on them to move south. Help us build a humanitarian zone in the Mawasi area so that we can concentrate all of the humanitarian aid to one certain place. UNRWA said no to all of that. No, we're not going to help you move people. No, we're not going to call on them to move. And no, we are definitely not going to build a humanitarian zone in the Mawasi. These three no decisions are important until this very day. One of the reasons why the war is still raging in Gaza at a high level of intensity is because Israel has to operate much slower in order to defeat an enemy, which is using their civilians as human shields. Had we been able to move the civilians to temporary locations, I'm not talking about far-fetched scenarios like moving them to Sinai for a temporary stage and keeping them really out of fighting, but let's say only inside the Gaza Strip, the war would probably have already ended by now, with far less civilian casualties. But the priority of UNRWA isn't to prevent civilian casualties, it is to keep itself in place, and it is to facilitate the rule of Hamas over the Gaza Strip. Hamas and UNRWA go hand in hand. Hamas without UNRWA cannot govern. Hamas without UNRWA would have to force to split the international aid that they get and to think, well, what do I want to spend it on? Do I want to spend it on schools, roads, hospitals, clinics, and mosques, or do I want to spend it on tunnels and rockets and bombs and to pay salaries to Hamas officials and to Hamas fighters and to import weapons from Iran? And as long as UNRWA is there, Hamas doesn't have that dilemma. They can take all of the international aid that comes from the world to Gaza, and all of it goes towards building the civilian parts of Gaza. And they, Hamas, can then focus all of their resources underground. And that's, by the way, not me saying it. I had kind of an epiphany moment. I was listening to an interview. This was in mid-October, listening to an interview by a senior Hamas official called Bassem Naim. He said it on the Russian propaganda channel called RT. He was asked by the interviewer, why doesn't Hamas let civilians down into the tunnels so that they are protected from Israeli bombardments? And he looked at him like, oh, what a silly question you ask. And he said, this isn't our responsibility. We are resistance, we are mukawama. Our job is to use everything that we have in order to fight Israel. And anything that is above ground, that's the responsibility of the UN, not ours. And I think it's so telling, it's so important to understand the mindset of Hamas leadership. They are not responsible for the well-being of civilians. Their job is to fight, to wage jihad against Israel, and not to waste their resources on protecting civilians. So they refused to help protect civilians in Gaza. Israel exposed in a rare moment of good public relations and using military intelligence in order to prove a point, Israel exposed that about 1,200 UNRWA members are also active Hamas members. And Israel also exposed, in that same batch of information, that 7 active UNRWA members also participated in the atrocities of October the 7th, going into Israel and participating in the killings. UNRWA, as I'm sure many of you know, educates or brainwashes Gazan children that Israel doesn't exist, that Jews don't have a right to live in Israel, and that the road to glory is in the path of jihad, and that the way to achieve glory is through martyrdom, shuhada. That is what they are taught in UN-funded and UN-manned schools. And I've spoken with friends of mine, soldiers used to be mine, who are now reserve officers and fighting inside Gaza. And everyone, they tell the same story as they fight, as they go and fight in different neighborhoods. There's fighting in a neighborhood. Hamas pops out of tunnels, fights against the IDF. Then they use UNRWA schools to fight from. The IDF goes towards those schools. There's fighting in the school. IDF kills the Hamas fighters, sometimes with casualties, sometimes not. And then the IDF does a scan or sweep of that building. In each and every classroom that they go in, there's a map, there is Palestine, and there's no Israel. And when you speak about long-term effects, this is the most important weapon. For children educated in UNRWA schools, there is no Israel. UNRWA facilities, their schools, their clinics, their logistics centers, their offices, their headquarters, all of that was used systematically, not by one chance, but systematically used by Hamas and Islamic Jihad to fight against Israel, to fire rockets at Israeli civilians from, and to conduct operations. Now, if we try to wrap up these two UN forces, one a peacekeeping force under the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and one a UN program, a special program with special funding and special budget. And if we try to look at solutions, then obviously the best thing for the Middle East, for Lebanon, for Israel, and for Gaza would be for the Iranian regime to cease promoting terror. If that happens, then many of the problems go away, almost like this. Since we cannot count on that, then I think we should focus on what the probable solutions could be. Two different UN entities, I think we should be frank about it, have failed in their missions to maintain stability and protect the people, both in Gaza, Lebanon, not both, in Gaza, Lebanon, and Israel, from horrible war. One of these organizations can at least show that they have tried to implement their mandate, UNIFIL, and the other, UNRWA, has such a vague mission statement. If you ask them, what are you supposed to do? Then they tell you humanitarian aid and educate and provide basic necessary needs for Palestinians. But what they do is really perpetuate war. And perhaps the vague definition of their mandate is by design. It's not supposed to end. If we must have a peacekeeping force in Lebanon, and currently what's being negotiated, or what was negotiated until approximately a week ago by France, the US, and others, is to find some kind of peacekeeping solution for Lebanon, like a 1701 minus, a reduced 1701, where we're not talking about all of southern Lebanon that should be free from Hezbollah, but only a part along the Israeli border, 5 kilometers, 7 kilometers from the border, so that Israeli civilians can go back to their homes. So if we must have such a solution, then I think that the absolutely most important thing would be to equip these peacekeepers with a Chapter 7 mandate, not a Chapter 6. What's the difference, you ask? Chapter 6 means that they can only use force in order to protect themselves. Chapter 7 means that they can use force in order to make sure that the mandate is implemented. So if they see a Hezbollah fighter who is preparing to fire an anti-tank missile towards an Israeli community, they don't only stand and take a report and call it in on the radio, but they actually use their weapons in order to stop it. That's the difference between Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. I have serious doubts, knowing a bit of how the UN works, UN peacekeeping and international deals. I have my serious personal doubts that I hope are totally wrong. But I have doubts that such a force will come into being, and I have doubts that it really will provide the minimum necessary required security for Israelis to be able to go back home. And let's be honest, and with this we'll soon get to the questions. For many years, Israel wasn't clear either about what it wanted to do with UNRWA in Gaza. For many years, Israel didn't say loud and clear and unequivocally that UNRWA is horrible, it is an obstacle to peace, and that UNRWA needs to go. Now, finally, Israel is talking in a bit clearer way, and there's a bit more clarity in the messages, and I hope that it will remain like that. In my mind, UNRWA must be replaced by local and regional organizations that are not corrupted by Hamas and that actually want to serve the people who need it, Palestinians there. And the aim is to release Palestinians from the bonds of dependency, not to have them dependent on aid, but to have them grow, become responsible for themselves, about their future, the education of their children, and the consequences of their decisions, and for them to prioritize life and living, and not jihad and misery. And in my mind, that's the only way to a dignified existence, to stability, to prosperity, and perhaps one day, inshallah, as we say in the region, to achieve peace. Once UNRWA is removed from Gaza, I think it should be dislodged from the entire Middle East. In order to promote chances for future reconciliation and stability, I am aware how big of an undertaking that is, and I am aware of the political situation, and I am also aware of how delicate the chances of success are, but I think that we at least, the first stage or the first step to solving a problem is acknowledging what the problem is, and in many things that are related to Israel and the Palestinians, UNRWA is really part of the problem. Now, with this I'll conclude. The alternatives to what I suggested, a Chapter 7 strong and very motivated peacekeeping force in Lebanon, which I think is a semi-realistic option, and the removal of UNRWA from Gaza. The alternatives, I think, are continued war, suffering, and instability in the Middle East. This instability and war will serve Iran, Russia, and it will hurt Israel and Europe. And anybody that wants to keep instability and poverty and terrorism and fighting and misery and Palestinian dependence should ask for UNRWA to stay and vote for them to stay in power. And anybody who wants the different things should act in order to get UNRWA out of the way. Thank you.
So many questions for you. You should think they are CNN anchors, all of them.
These are good people. Why do you say that about them?
Oh, yeah. They love me so much that I can tease them a little bit. 7 months of war. Why hasn't Israel been able to defeat Hamas?
Good question. I think in honesty, Israel said from the beginning, the IDF said, the government said, the Minister of Defense, the Prime Minister, the Chief of Staff, they're all on record saying that this isn't going to be a quick fix. That the challenges that Israel faces in Gaza specifically, but also all around us, close and further away, isn't something that will be a short, quick, and painless operation, that it will take time, it will take months, and perhaps more than that, and those are the words of the Defense Minister, Gallant. Yeah. And I think that realistically, in some parts of the operations, the IDF advanced very well and rather quickly, with a low amount of casualties on Israeli side and also on the Palestinian side, the civilian side. Yep. I think that if there's one big part of Israeli decision-making that perhaps has been slowing us down, and it's not the tactical activities on the ground. Each encounter that you see between IDF and Hamas terrorists on the ground, it ends very clearly with an IDF victory and Hamas either trying to look like civilians again, or dying or wounded or captured. What isn't happening enough, in my mind, is to translate tactical achievements on the ground, the conquest of Rafah, the conquest of the conquest of Gaza City, of Khan Yunis, and many other things, into strategic achievements. Yeah. And I think that is the missing piece so far. I have trust that that will improve and that now Israel will finally get into Rafah, defeat Hamas there, and get on the way to really completing the maneuver.
And another person asked, why didn't Israel start in the south? Why not start to close the Philadelphia corridor?
That person is very smart. The reason, as I understand it, is hypersensitivity in Washington and in Jerusalem to dictates from Cairo.
Yep.
And it makes basic, pure, excellent military sense to go Gaza City, Rafah, cut the back door, slam it shut, so to send a message to all of the other fighters and cowards who call themselves fighters that are Hamas terrorists in Gaza that you may fight, but there's nothing more coming in and there's no way out. And that, in hindsight, probably should have been done. I assume, I semi-know, assess that most of the reason had to do with the delicate situation with Egypt and an Israeli calculation that we will need Egypt in the future for any possible reconciliation, rebuilding, etc. Relations with Egypt are very important, and Egypt, unlike Israel, they're not squeamish. They don't care about Palestinians. They don't care about suffering. They have absolutely no regard. Palestinians can die by the millions and they wouldn't miss a heartbeat. And they wouldn't be criticized for it either. And the Egyptians were very clear from the beginning, nobody comes across the Rafah crossing, and we can help, we can send in trucks, and we can get international credit for it, but nothing is coming into Sinai, and we reject, and we will oppose, any IDF operations in Rafah. And it took us 7 months to finally take the Rafah corridor, or the Rafah crossing.
Yeah. What about the death tolls? Why isn't Israel better in communicating the numbers of Hamas terrorists killed, for example?
Yeah. In my mind, this is a strategic shortcoming and poor decision made by Israel. I can actually prove, and I'm on record saying that in the second week of the war, I told commanders in the IDF, and I said it in the IDF spokesperson unit when I was there in reserves, we have to start counting. We have to start counting dead enemy combatants, otherwise referred to as Hamas terrorists, and we have to start counting, or at least having some visibility over non-combatants. Why? Because this will be the main weapon that our enemies will use against us in order to erode our legitimacy and in order to erode our ability to continue to defend ourselves. And I also said that we need a humanitarian plan that needs to make sense, and we need to present it. Even though, and I think on a human level, if you spoke with Israelis and if you read Israeli media or perhaps you saw Israeli TV, if you felt what Israelis felt immediately after October the 7th, the feelings were feelings of tremendous rage. There was a demand in Israel by the Israeli population of revenge. Israelis wanted revenge, which I think is very, very natural. When you see the atrocities that Hamas did, how happily they were going into communities and butchering children and women and raping and mutilating, then a very human response is, I want to get back at them. That's on the human popular level. On the strategic level, of course, different considerations exist. And what the government should have been able to do and to process is to balance the tension between what the popular will is and also what's good and strategic long-term for the state of Israel. And in this case, I think that Israel has done tremendous work in order to protect civilians in the battlefield. Israel has taken precautions like no other military has in order to minimize civilian casualties. Israel is unfairly scrutinized and held to impossible standards that no other military is held to. And despite having said that, I still, again, look inwards and say we should have presented a plan and we should have been able to tell specifically Washington and others, this is what we're going to do, this is our calculation, now we need your help in doing it.
So So do you have an estimate of how many enemy combatants that have been killed?
Yeah, the most updated IDF estimate, which is a moving number. First of all, let's be clear that nobody knows.
Yep.
It's a very complex and dynamic situation. The data is very sketchy, but IDF estimates that they undersign and say that they believe in are of between 13,000 and 14,000 Hamas combatants. And the same amount, perhaps a little bit more, that have been severely or moderately wounded by the IDF and are basically out of commission. Those are the numbers. Now, if you analyze the Hamas Health Ministry numbers of casualties in Gaza, first of all, they don't make sense. They don't make sense because they don't correlate with the demographics of the Gaza Strip. They don't correlate with the basic human demographics of half men and half male and half female population. There's a 70% overrepresentation of women, children, and the elderly. The age group of 19 to 33-year-old men, very much missing from the statistics that Hamas puts out. And what I'm amazed, and I've had many conversations with what I thought were serious journalists, and I tell them, look at these numbers and apply a tenth of the analysis power that you apply on Israel when we say something, when we provide information, when we provide footage, when we provide a video. You scrutinize and you analyze and you fact check and BBC couldn't independently verify and CNN couldn't see and blah, blah, blah. You don't do this with Hamas numbers. They don't make sense. If you look at how many casualties each day, from which locations, in some area the number of casualties go down, even though they're supposed to go up. And in some areas it spirals out of control. There are so many inconsistencies. And to show, now for the first time 4 or 5 days ago, one of the UN agencies that for 6 months basically took Hamas figures and took off the logo on the Hamas page and put the UN logo on it, OCHA, and they said, well, actually, the number is perhaps between 28 and 30,000, and also about that we don't know because there are many unaccounted for, and there are problems with identification. And up until that stage, they were hand in hand with Hamas. Hamas said 500 killed in the El Ahli hospital, 500 were killed in the El Ahli hospital by Israel. No verification, no process of doing anything. So the problem is a willing atmosphere around the world, lazy journalists and editors, Israel that didn't put enough brain power into scrutiny of their figures and to presenting a figure of our own. And I think the most telling moment, which for me was the saddest moment, was the State of the Union address by President Biden. The president goes on stage and quotes Hamas numbers as if they are the truth and doesn't even say that they are Hamas numbers.
Yeah.
That's a win for Hamas.
Yeah. Jonathan, thanks a lot. So many questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. But he will be here also tomorrow morning. So please return.
Thank you. Thank you. Chocolate for the kids. Thank you.